welcome. Really, really thrilled. This is just a dream team for me of writers who are talking about their lived experiences, but also people who've thought really, really hard and long about these sorts of issues. And this particular event is being run or being organized by Winnie Lee, who is a writer in residence with the SHaME project and the author of just a brilliant book in this area called Dark Chapter, but I'll let her talk about that. She is dedicated to survivor-centered discourses and dialogues, and also has founded Clear Lines. Many people from Clear Lines are in this session today, which is the UK's first only festival using the arts and discussion to address questions of sexual violence. But you're not here to hear me rattle on and do housekeeping. Winnie, let me just turn it on over to you.
Thank you so much. I think we're all still trying to adjust to Microsoft Teams. I think many of us are probably more familiar with Zoom. I think it's going to be a work in progress as we work with this kind of technological setup. But technology obviously can give us certain headaches, but it also can do some amazing things. And one of the really good things to have come out of pandemic and the whole switch that we've had to meeting online is that we're able to bring together this panel, which I think spans 5 time zones. And I think as Joanna had mentioned, it's an absolute dream panel for me, right? And I remember when we were thinking about who are we going to invite to speak on this panel, I wanted a graphic memoirist or graphic novelist. I wanted a poet. I wanted a memoirist, a prose memoirist. And I was like, okay, well, who are some of the leaders in their field? And I'm like, Susan Brison, right? We're going to invite her. We're going to invite Shivanee Ramlochan. And even though Susan's in Vermont and Shivanee's in Trinidad, and Un and I are in the UK, I kind of thought, well, this is actually something we can do online. So we're so excited about this panel. For me, the reason that I wanted to have this discussion was because as you can notice, this entire discussion is being in some ways hosted by the SHaME project at Birkbeck University, which is Wellcome Trust funded, and you can go onto the website and probably they phrase it much better than me, but it's a number of different scholars who are exploring sexual harms through different fields, different disciplines, for example, sociology or anthropology, psychology. And I was always struck, as somebody who is both a writer and a survivor and kind of an academic, I was always struck by the amount of work that's being done in academia around sexual violence. And I came to academia as a PhD student. I'm still a PhD student. It's taken me a long time to do my PhD. In some ways, as a result of my own activism, right? So I was a survivor, I was a writer, and then became an activist, and then I decided to become an academic to kind of give myself the credibility to pursue my activism in different ways. So I was always surprised by how much work is already being done and has been done for decades. I mean, Susan can speak to this because, she's been in a philosopher for decades. Around this issue, and how so much of that research and knowledge almost wasn't being translated across into the public sphere, into the media, into the way the public thinks about sexual violence. And obviously, in the past few years, we've had #MeToo become a popular hashtag. We've had the Sarah Everard murder. We've had a number of other cases that are constantly raising the public awareness about violence against women, around femicide, around sexual violence. But sometimes you feel like there's no progress being made, even though there's all this academic research that's been happening. And then on the other side, you have a lot of activist work that's been going on for decades. You have amazing works of art, not just these authors, but many other authors and visual artists, filmmakers, theater makers out there who are creating work. And sometimes you just wonder, what does it take to actually change the public opinion and the public understanding around sexual violence? Has there been progress? And are any of these conversations happening in academia filtering over to the public, or filtering over to how everyday members of society are thinking about these issues? So I kind of wanted to build a bridge around that. And a lot of that for me comes through writing. And there's different forms of writing. There's academic writing. There's also creative writing. And there's some people who maybe are constantly following news coverage of rape and sexual violence, may have never read a poem written by a survivor, or may have never actually looked at a piece of graphic memoir about lived experience. So I kind of felt like, well, let's kind of have a taster where people can see different kinds of work that's being created by artists and writers around this issue, which is informed by a lived experience or a certain knowledge of the issues involved. So I'm just going to start with a brief introduction of our different writers, and then we'll actually go to Una, who's our graphic novelist, graphic memoirist, to present some of her work. Una is an artist and writer. Her first graphic novel, Becoming Unbecoming, was published in 2015, and it was widely translated, featured on BBC Radio 4 Open Book, Woman's Hour in Newsweek, the New York Times. It won a Prix Artemisia and has been translated, actually adapted into a theatrical work in Brazil. And her other graphic novels are On Sanity, One Day in Two Lives, a book about her mother's psychotic illness, Cree, a book about a group of women in a small town in County Durham, commissioned by New Writing North, and Eve, a chilling story set in a small northern town, coming next month from Virago Press. Una lives in Leeds. And in just a few minutes, she's going to show us some pages from Becoming Unbecoming. But obviously, I'd love to introduce our other speakers first. So Shivanee Ramlochan is a Trinidadian poet and essayist joining us from Trinidad. Her first book of poems, Everyone Knows I Am a Haunting, came out with People Tree Press in 2017. It was a finalist for the People's Choice TNT Book of the Year, shortlisted for the Forward Prize for Best First Collection, and you yourself was shortlisted for the Bridport Prize for Poetry. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on the Red Thread cycle, which is a section of that a collection of yours. And so that cycle won a Small Acts Literary Competition Prize for Poetry, and it was on audiovisual display at the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas in 2019, which is quite fascinating, just these crossovers with different art forms, I find. And Shivanee's received residencies from the Breadloaf Writers Conference, the Malay Colony, and the Catapult Caribbean Arts Grant. And you've served as a poetry reader and as an editorial judge for Commonwealth Writers, Honeysuckle Press, Moco Magazine, and others. And you yourself are a book critic, often focusing mainly on Caribbean and queer literature. And people can find your reviews at novelniche.net. And finally, it's a huge honor to have Susan J. Brison joining us from Vermont. Susan is a professor of philosophy and the Eunice and Julian Cohen Professor for the Study of Ethics and Human Values at Dartmouth College in the U.S. And she's been a visiting professor at Princeton University and a member of the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Having survived a near-fatal rape and murder attempt in France in 1990, Susan has firsthand experience of how traumatic violence shatters a self and how a self can be rebuilt in connection with others. Through her book, Aftermath, Violence in the Remaking of a Self, which we'll be speaking about in a few minutes, and for scholarly articles and lectures, Susan has brought greater philosophical attention to the topics of rape, domestic violence, hate speech, and image-based abuse. She's raised public awareness of gender-based violence through international talks, radio and television interviews, and articles in the New York Times, The Guardian, Time, and other newspapers and magazines. So thank you very much for joining us, to the three of you. And I'm going to hand it over to Una so you could possibly share with us a few pages from Becoming Unbecoming.
Okay, thanks, Winnie. Before I share the pages, I'm just going to kind of set the scene a little bit. A number of sexual offences and sexually violent crimes were committed against me between the age of 10 and 16 by multiple perpetrators. I wasn't protected and I didn't get any justice. These experiences stole my childhood and they ruined my health. I eventually recovered enough to live the happy life that I'm living now, and I decided to write and draw a book about not only my own experience but also the context within which it took place. Becoming Unbecoming helped to restore my balance. It gave me a voice. It allowed me to tell my story, but also it allowed me to analyse the situation that I was living in at the time and the kind of situation that we're all living in now. Now, writing and drawing this story, it gave me my power back, and it seems to have helped others all over the world to find a voice too. It took me a long time to even begin to understand my experiences as crimes against me, because for a long time I thought that everything that happened was my own fault. This is quite usual, especially of people who experience these things as children, and it's a feeling that takes some shaking off, I've found. These are the crimes under UK law that grown men committed against me while I was a child. Sexual activity with a child or causing a child to engage in sexual activity, sexual assault, rape of a child under 13, unlawful detention or kidnapping, rape of a child under 16, including a multiple perpetrator rape, which is not currently a distinct crime, but I think should be, because typically there is a significant degree of planning involved in these crimes. All of this has had a lifelong impact on me in educational, financial, and emotional terms. Even though I've been well recovered from the psychological trauma for almost 2 decades, I still suffer from physical health problems because of damage to my nervous system. So the after effects of these crimes will always be with me. Nearly all of these crimes carry a maximum sentence of life imprisonment, reflecting the seriousness of the crime and the lifelong impact on the victim. Nothing was reported at the time, but most of what was happening was known about by adults and children around me, and there was some police involvement, but no action was taken other than to send me to see a psychiatrist, which, as I say in my book, implied there was something wrong with me. I eventually reported historic crimes in 2014 when there was a huge wave of reporting after the Jimmy Savile scandal, but no action was taken and the case was dropped after a token investigation. What I'm describing here is the experience of an overwhelming majority of victims of sexually violent crimes. It's not unusual for this to happen. I'm not alone in this, but of course, that's no comfort. I'm going to show you some pages from Becoming Unbecoming and read them to you. So Ria, I think, is going to share the first image. The reason I want to show you this one is because I want to impress that I started life as just an ordinary kid. My favourite times were Christmas and summer holidays. At Christmas, I carried a pillowcase around full of presents, pretending to be Santa. And when we went on holiday in the summer, I'd wander slowly along the beach, imagining I was a character in a book, a pirate's wife, a dragon hunter, an orphaned girl in a story of thieves, smugglers, afternoon tea and boarding schools. People were always telling me I had a vivid imagination, and you'll notice there that I was a pirate's wife because in the 1960s and 70s, girls weren't really encouraged to be pirates themselves. Can we have the next image? So here I've included this image because the nature of the drawing in the book, much of the drawing is quite metaphoric, because although it's a book about rape and murder and a period of time which was extremely violent and misogynistic, there's very little violence depicted in the book directly. And I've done this because I wanted to be restrained in a way that challenges people. It kind of draws them in rather than repelling them, because I want to get people thinking and discussing, because I think that this is the way towards change. The next image is an image of some of the context that was happening while I was experiencing what I was experiencing. There was a serial killer in Yorkshire who turned out to be a man called Peter Sutcliffe, who was from Bradford. We didn't know that at the time. I'm just going to read you this page. I used to walk to school. Slag. I enjoyed walking across the fields, sometimes. One day, the girls were told not to walk to school anymore, but to catch the bus instead, and never alone. Boys were not given any instructions. All girls, everywhere, had now to be careful, because the Ripper had killed another young woman. This time, people were outraged. The police issued a statement. He has made it clear that he hates prostitutes. Many people do. We, as a police force, will continue to arrest prostitutes, but the Ripper is now killing innocent girls. That indicates your mental state and that you are in need of medical attention. You've made your point. Give yourself up before another innocent woman dies. So it seemed that it was reasonable to want to kill some women, but perhaps not others. So, as I was growing up, I learned that maybe I belonged in the group of women that other people wanted to kill. If we move on to the next image, I think I want to say here that everyone knew about what was happening to me, but everyone thought it was my fault. And this didn't seem right or fair to me at the time, but I was so ashamed I couldn't speak up for myself, and no one spoke up for me. And I was tormented at school. One day at school, at lunchtime, I walked into the canteen and was greeted by a baying mob. I stared straight ahead and kept on walking. A teacher came to take me quietly out of assembly. I was removed from school for a while and taken to see our silent friend, the psychiatrist. And of course, this again is very typical, that it's often the victim of the violent crime, the girl, that's taken out of the school rather than the other way around. If we look at the next image, this is so many ways of saying whore in different languages, and me walking the tightrope between freedom of a landscape over here and the kind of dirt of whoredom over here. And here, an open message to the Ripper. Both the police and the media were very keen to talk to the person that they decided to call the Yorkshire Ripper. They didn't seem as keen to find out what women thought. Next picture is called All the 1970s. I'm going to read this one to you. The excuses that predatory men make for their behaviour are given further credence by societies all over the world that are deeply confused about sex and respectability. Because of this confusion, in the UK, we've ended up with the whole of the 1970s on trial, because justice is still justice, even if it's 30 years late. A number of men whom people thought highly of turned out to be not all they seemed. Sexual assault was against the law in the 70s too, but these men knew they could get away with it. One Yorkshire man in particular has compelled us to finally confront the problem. Jimmy Savile, TV presenter, charity fundraiser, celebrity, invited many guests to his penthouse flat overlooking the park, including some of West Yorkshire's finest police officers. But the police weren't the only ones who thought he was a good guy. For decades, he was on every TV screen, in every newspaper, doing good deeds, accessing all areas. He was a VIP, rubbing shoulders with the elite. How surprised they all were when he was revealed to be such a prolific sex offender, a rapist, paedophile, hebephile, ephebophile, gerontophile, and necrophile, and that all of this has happened right under their noses. Next image. There's no doubt we need a reliable system of justice, but we can't blame the justice system for the things it thinks and does if it just thinks and does the same things as everyone else. Those are people behind the uniforms and robes, and when they manage to bring a case to court, 12 people like you and I, chosen at random, get the last word. It's all part of the same landscape. Change takes time, I hear you say. We've had a few thousand years. How much longer before we're rid of this dead weight? So, what can I do now? I found that making art on this subject has really helped people to discuss it. And I think that open discussion, honesty about these issues will eventually shift the culture. I do feel optimistic. I think we have to be optimistic. I'd like there to be less sexual violence. I'd like there to be more justice. During the time that I've been touring with the book, Becoming Unbecoming, I've led a lot of discussions and workshops, including in languages that are not my own. We had some very productive talks in Italy, for example. And Becoming Unbecoming is taught widely across the United States in schools and colleges. But my main inspiration right now are these people. Can we have the next image? So this is Collettivo Rubra, a youth theatre in a workers' town outside Sao Paulo, who wrote to me asking if they could use Becoming Unbecoming in their workshops. 2 years ago, I visited them and collaborated on a theatre piece where they are all una. Next image. This was one of the most interesting experiences I've had, because until this happened, I honestly didn't think that the integrity, the aesthetic of the work would translate well into a theatre piece. I thought that it would become too spectacular, and I'm against spectacle, I think. But because they did it so sensitively and they adhered so kindly to my own work and listened and used their own honesty to kind of make this theatre piece, it's actually worked really, really well. And as a result of this, I'm going to start an initiative in the UK called Red Dress Collective, where we're going to help people to make theatre pieces about sexual violence, to make artworks about sexual violence, and use Becoming Unbecoming as a model. So if anyone's interested in this, we do have a website. It's called reddresscollective.com. You can go and visit it later, have a look at what we do. It's very, very new. We don't have any funding yet. We're just a few people who are trying to make a bit of a difference. Oh, here we go. Here's the website, yeah. And that is the end of my talk. I'm really interested to hear what you've all got to say. So, please do ask me questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Una. I first met Una in 2015 because we've both been shortlisted for the Emma Humphreys Prize, and Una said, I drew a book. And I was like, what does that mean you drew a book, right? I'm like, oh, she's a graphic novelist. And then you gave me a copy of your book, and it blew me away because it was so powerful. And I think the presentation you've just given really speaks to the ability of the arts to reach across borders, to reach across cultural specificities, because in some ways your story is so very much rooted in growing up in Yorkshire in the 1970s, right? And you make all these references to like songs and bands I've never heard of, right? As an American, who grew up in the 80s and 90s, right? And the whole Jimmy Savile, the story, I didn't know who Jimmy Savile was, right? Until the news broke about him. And obviously that was a huge case in the UK to know that this, media, this celebrity was actually committing acts of sexual abuse for a long time. And I think with a lot of the research I've done with survivors, they found that the media coverage of the Jimmy Savile case is actually what prompted them to speak up. So in some ways, a lot of media coverage around these issues can then impact upon individual survivors and the way we think about things, and the way we think about speech and the need to speak up and the need to tell our own stories. And you'll see that recurring in, I think, some of the other speakers that we're going to be hearing from today. I would love to talk to you a bit more, Una, which we will do in a little while. But I also want to obviously introduce Shivanee, who I first heard about when I met Ruth Padel, the poet, who said, oh, if you're looking at sexual violence, here's a woman you really need to read, and that's Shivanee Ramlochan. So I got your collection of poems, which is here, available from People Tree Press, and I was blown away because it is so powerful and so unique also in the way that you have this central cycle called the red thread cycle, but then also you really bring to life the experience of being a woman in a culture that many of us don't know about. So there's lots of reference to deities and to religious ceremonies and to sort of family structures that we're unfamiliar with if you're not familiar with Trinidadian culture. So I just love the richness of that. And I think your work really speaks to, for any of us who are experiencing sexual violence, sexual harassment, those experiences are embedded in a wider culture. And it's also embedded within our own life experience up into those acts. And so we often have to navigate existing in this culture and continuing to exist after those sorts of trauma. So I was blown away when I read your poems, and I would love to hear you read a few of them. So would you be willing to tell us a little about the red thread cycle and to share, read one or two of your poems?
Thank you so much, Winnie, and thank you to everyone who's here and to all of the organizers for creating this powerful and safe space. I am honored to be joining all of you from Trinidad and Tobago, which is where I was born and have always lived. I often say that the spine of this book, which is my first and only book so far, is the Red Thread Cycle, which is a series of 7 poems in the center of the collection. And when I felt most uncertain about everything else in the book, the truth that these poems needed to convey often carried me through, particularly when I felt terrified that people would read them, that they would exist in a public space, and that I would have to, one way or another, stand by them and declare things about myself or people I had known. But the essential truth of the poems demanded to be told, They were these 7 poems, the things in the book that kept me up at night, and said that whatever I might try to hide from myself, the facts of what they were saying were indispensable. And of course, there's been a beautiful safeguarding statement put out. But of course, these poems do contain graphic depictions of sexual assault and violence. There are some references in the first poem to the Trinidad Carnival, which is one of our country's most spectacular events. And even if you're not familiar with the carnival, then you can think of it as a space in which I was trying to reconcile great beauty and great pain in the work. On the 3rd anniversary of the rape, don't say Tunapuna Police Station. Say you found yourself in the cave of a minotaur, not knowing how you got there, with a lap of red thread. Don't say forced anal entry. Say you learned that some flowers bloom and die at night. Say you remember stamen, filament, cross-pollination. Say that hummingbirds are vital to the process. Give the minotaur time to write in the police ledger. Lap the red thread around the hummingbird vase. Don't say, I took out the garbage alone, and he grabbed me by the waist, and he was handsome. Say Shakespeare. Recite Macbeth for the tropics. Lady Macbeth was the queen of carnival, and she stabbed Banquo with a vagrant's shiv during Juvet. She danced a blood dingole and gave her husband a dimanche gras upbraiding. I am in mud and glitter, so far steeped that going back is not an option. Don't say rapist. Say engineer of aerosol deodorant, because pepper spray is illegal. Anything is illegal. Fight back too hard and it's illegal. Your nails are illegal. Don't say you have a vagina. Say he stole your insurance policy, your bank boxes, your first car down payment. Say he took something he'll be punished for taking, not something you're punished for holding, like red thread between your thighs. So that poem is the first in the red thread cycle, and I'm going to share the last, the 7th poem, and it's called The Open Mic of Every Dia Burning. So a dia is a small earthenware, usually clay vessel. It's very significant to Hindus in India and of course the diaspora, of which Trinidad and Tobago is a significant part during Diwali, which is the Hindu holy festival of lights. I would say about this poem, which brings the red thread cycle to a close, is that the hardest thing to give myself in writing these poems was any kind of reclamation of the self, the idea that I was working through poems to process extraordinary pain, and I felt that that was the sole objective. But I hope that when people take this journey through these poems. They come to a place where, if there is not always ultimate solace, that there is a space for light, symbolized by the deer. The open mic of every deer burning. I took to that stage, knifed in, leaking witch hazel and chandelier bush, briar packed by puncheon, hard enough to fuck that 3-day sickness to the cross. I ground the belly of my gun against his bare flank, against his sour stem still dripping with me. When the poem told me to go on my knees, I went. I limped past high road through the dry river gutter, my love. I let the glass pauper my shins. I lit hurricane lamps with the lucifers of the stake he splintered 6 inches inside me, 6 knuckle fathoms deep. The poem says, truss him gullet to groin with leather and lyre wire. Loop the cry around your wrist, like he wound your hair to the bedpost and knotted you there for safekeeping. The poem says, give no thanks. I tell it, flinching through the verses, fumbling for a post to push me upright. I strip, feel spectator eyes, finger the crumbled spires where my wings used to be. There lies an ache in the place I was ransacked. Only this poem knows it. Each line break bursts me open for applause, hands slapping like something hard and holy is grating out gold hallelujahs beneath the proscenium of his grave.
I mean, I suppose what I love about your work and about poetry in general is that, unlike other kinds of writing, particularly if you think about poetry doesn't need to convey specific facts. And so, news media, there's a hang up with things like, what was the truth? Like, what time of day was it? Who was the perpetrator? Who was the victim? How did it happen? What was she wearing? And in contrast, your poetry just exists in this fluid world of symbolism and imagery and meanings that are maybe slightly obscured or not entirely clear to everyone, but in some sense your details are picked out and highlighted, but other facts are obscured, and it doesn't really matter about those facts because, as you said, there's some truth that comes out, and someone that isn't familiar with Trinidadian culture or something that has lived in a different time period or grew up in a different time period, grew up in Yorkshire in the 1970s can still relate to the absolute emotional truth that's captured in those poems. So I think that speaks incredibly to the power of your writing. So it's incredible to have you join us, and thank you for sharing that with us. And we'll obviously be talking more about it in the discussion. So Susan, some of the things that have already been said really, really connect with your work because it's, Shivanee said, writing the poetry is in some ways maybe about a reclamation of the self, and your entire work, Aftermath, is about trying to piece together the self after the trauma of rape and in your case, attempted murder. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about Aftermath and do a brief reading from your book, and then we can kind of segue into a wider discussion.
Sure. I'm just so moved to be here, and I'm so grateful to Winnie for organizing this. And I read Dark Chapter and Shivanee's Everyone Knows I'm a Haunting and Una's Becoming Unbecoming, and learned so much and was so deeply moved in ways that I think fiction and poetry and graphic novels can do in a way that philosophy can't generally. So I feel the limitations of philosophy, but also in writing this book, unlike writing any other philosophy I wrote, I drew on poems that I had been writing. I write poetry. I don't publish it, but I couldn't rely on the analytical tools that my profession had given me. So I want to read a little bit. Unlike Shivanee's gorgeous and wrenching poetry, I start chapter 1 of this book with just a factual description. This is what happened. On July 4th, 1990, at 10:30 in the morning, I went for a walk along a peaceful-looking country road in a village outside Grenoble, France. It was a gorgeous day, and I didn't envy my husband, Tom, who had to stay inside and work on a manuscript with a French colleague of his. I sang to myself as I set out, stopping to pet a goat and pick a few wild strawberries along the way. About an hour and a half later, I was lying face down in a muddy creek bed at the bottom of a dark ravine, struggling to stay alive. I'd been grabbed from behind, pulled into the bushes, beaten and sexually assaulted. Feeling absolutely helpless and entirely at my assailant's mercy, I talked to him, calling him sir, monsieur. I tried to appeal to his humanity, and when that failed, I addressed myself to his self-interest. He called me a whore and told me to shut up. Although I'd said I would do whatever he wanted, as the sexual assault began, I instinctively fought back, which so enraged my attacker that he strangled me until I lost consciousness. When I awoke, I was being dragged by my feet down into a ravine. I had often, while dreaming, thought I was awake, but now I was awake and convinced I was having a nightmare. But it was no dream. He strangled me again. I wish I could convey the horror of losing consciousness while my animal instincts desperately fought the effects of strangulation. This time I was sure I was done, but I revived, just in time to see him lunging towards me with a rock. He smashed it into my forehead, knocking me out, and eventually, after another strangulation attempt, left me for dead. Now, a few months after I survived, I sat down at my computer to write about it for the first time, and all I could come up with was a list of paradoxes. Things had stopped making sense. I thought it was quite possible I was brain damaged as a result of the head injuries I had sustained, or perhaps the heightened lucidity I had experienced during the assault remained, giving me a clearer, although profoundly disorienting, picture of the world. I had turned to philosophy for meaning and consolation and could find neither. Had my reasoning broken down? Or was it the breakdown of reason? I couldn't explain what had happened to me. I was attacked for no reason. I had ventured outside the human community, landed beyond the moral universe, beyond the realm of predictable events and comprehensible actions, and I didn't know how to get back. As a philosopher, I was used to taking something apparently obvious and familiar, the nature of time, say, or the relation between words and things, and making it into something quite puzzling and strange. But now, when I was confronted with the utterly strange and paradoxical, philosophy was of no use in making me feel at home in the world. After I was rescued and taken to the Grenoble hospital, I was told repeatedly how lucky I was to be alive. And for a short while, I even believed this myself. My assailant was apprehended. There was a trial. He was convicted of rape and attempted murder. But at this time, I was in the hospital, and I had hired a lawyer to try to help me make sense of the French criminal justice system. And he told me, among other things, every morning when you wake up, you should be grateful to be here. Remember, he said, you're not supposed to be alive. Now, at the time, I didn't yet know how the trauma not only haunts the conscious and unconscious mind, but also remains in the body, in each of the senses, ready to resurface whenever something triggers the reliving of the traumatic event. I didn't know that the worst, the unimaginably painful aftermath of violence, was yet to come. And I wrote this book. It took me about 10 years to write it. And I noticed the other day, I wrote an afterword to it. And I wrote it right here where I'm sitting right now in Thetford, Vermont in the US, looking out at these beautiful meadows, mountains. I am so incredibly lucky to be here. And I dated this April 2001, so exactly 20 years ago. And want to just say one thing about why I decided to title the book Aftermath. I mean, we all know the typical meaning of this, that it's something that results or follows from an event, especially one that's really disastrous. But the original meaning, aftermath, comes from Old English, after, I can't pronounce it, but aftermath. It's a new growth of grass after a mowing. So there's the first growth, and then there's the aftergrowth, aftermath. And that, for me, just symbolized some real hope in all of this. So the last few sentences are, over spring has returned to Vermont. The fields are green, trees are in blossom, the pond is teeming, and the bluebirds are back. Life, profligate, irrepressible, flaunts itself everywhere. An overflowing of life, even for the least significant creatures. So much so that it all seems inevitable. Perhaps because it's impossible for us to imagine our own deaths. Our existence can feel necessary, bound to continue. But maybe my lawyer was right. I should remember that I'm not supposed to be alive. What if I take that as my starting point? None of us is supposed to be alive. We're all here by chance, and only for a little while. The wonder is that we've managed, once again, to winter through, and that our hearts, in spite of everything, survive. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was incredibly moving. And obviously, those are just short extracts that she read, but in between those extracts, there's quite stunning work of philosophy as well. And I'd love to hear from you a bit more in the discussion about how your own practice of being an academic and a philosopher was impacted by this experience. I think one of the reasons Susan's work struck me so much is because in a lot of ways your own experience of sexual violence was very similar to my own. We were both out walking on our own and were attacked by a stranger. And that is the stereotypical image of the rape that we see in the media, a woman out on her own who's attacked by somebody who jumps out from the bushes, right? I mean, I didn't read your book until 2015, so that was after I'd finished writing my novel. And I guess I just wanted to read a short section of my novel. I was originally going to read the whole prologue, but I don't think we have time for that, so I'm just going to read the few first paragraphs. Because, Susan, your work does address a lot about the annihilation of the self. So even though, for example, you weren't actually killed in that murder, there was a sense of having died a symbolic kind of death. And the sense of how the self is completely severed from the life that you knew before. And that was very, very clear to me in my experience of sexual violence and, you know, when I was followed by a stranger and raped. And so that's something I kind of explore a bit in my prologue. So I'm just going to read a few paragraphs from this and then we'll move to a general discussion. Oh, here we go. Ria's putting it up. They say events like this change your life forever, that your life will never be the same as it was the day before it happened, or even 2 hours before it happened, when I stood waiting for that bus out of Belfast, along the Falls Road to the west of the city. Is it melodramatic to think of life like that, of a clean split struck straight down the breadth of your existence, severing your first 29 years from all the years that come after? I look across that gap now, an unexpected rift in the contour of my life, and I long to shout across that ravine to the younger me who stands on the opposite edge, oblivious to what lies ahead. She is a distant speck. She seems lost from my perspective, but in her mind, she thinks she knows where she's going. There's a hiking guidebook in her hand and a path that she is following. It will lead here up this slope, and then along the edge of a plateau to gain the higher ground, merging with the hills above the city. She does not know who follows her. She's only thinking of the path ahead. But some things she cannot anticipate. I stand now on this side of the ravine, desperate to warn my earlier self of the person trailing her, skulking from bush to tree in her wake. Stop, I want to shout. It's not worth it. Just give up the trail and go home. But she wouldn't listen anyway. She's too stubborn, too determined to hike this trail on a day this crisp and clear. And now it's too late. She's in isolated country, and even if she were to turn back, she would inevitably encounter him, because he is behind her. I'm going to stop the reading there, so you can, as you can see, it obviously goes on, and there's a whole book that you can read if you want. But I think for me, I mean, I actually wrote those few paragraphs. I wrote the prologue a few weeks or months after my assault, which is a bit bizarre because obviously, as you can tell, it's written as if it was from the perspective of somebody years afterwards. And to this day, I don't know why I wrote it in that way. It was one of those kind of like bolt of lightning sort of things that strikes you, especially bearing in mind I was, post-traumatic at that point and I wasn't really functioning. But I just sat down and I wrote them. And I guess there was something about the perspective of it being me a few years afterwards, which made me think, okay, maybe I can make it through to those few years and there will be a time when I can look back to those moments just before the assault and obviously regret continuing on that walk. So even though it was impossible for me to try to understand what it would be like to be at that point a few years from now, I was trying to write from that perspective. And so the weird thing is obviously now it's 13 months since my assault, which actually the anniversary was 2 days ago. So for me, springtime, as you said, Susan, there's a celebration of life and nature. There's always that association for me with springtime and this time of year with my assault. But for me, with each passing year, at least the trauma hasn't been as bad. But Shivanee, in your first poem on the 3rd anniversary of your rape, there is so much about the passing of time and the anniversary and that yearly cycle to when an assault happens or when that kind of crime happens that reminds our bodies, reminds our minds of that kind of original trauma. But at the same time, there is a reminder of how far we may have come since then. So I think all of your work is sort of a testament to that, to the kind of work that can be created in the wake of lived experience or in the wake of navigating these kinds of stories. And I'd love to talk a bit more about it in a general discussion. We are running quite late, so if the audience does have questions, they feel free to please put it in the chat, and Emma Yap, one of our PhD researchers here, will be moderating that. But I'll start with a few questions, and then eventually Emma can come in with some of the ones from the audience. I guess, Una, a long time ago, a few years ago when we were chatting, I remember I was complaining about trying to figure out the ending of my novel. And obviously the novel is told from the viewpoint of not just the victim, but then also the perpetrator. And that was why I turned to fiction for that purpose. And I was having a fight with my editor because she wanted me to end the novel sooner. And I was like, no, there's the entire aftermath process. Like, it doesn't end with the criminal justice process. And just because there's a trial and there's this outcome doesn't mean that the story's over. And so, Una, you said, well, I mean, all of it, so much matters about where you put the frame, right? Like, because you could end the story there if you want, but then, I continued living and we've all continued living. Susan, I think your book came out 10 years after your experience, but now it's pretty much almost 30 years onwards, and so that frame has changed. So Una, as a graphic novelist or somebody who works in the visual medium, everything you do exists within a frame. And so you obviously have to think quite a lot about how you're going to show things or what you don't show. And I thought what was so interesting about your work is what you chose not to show, or the way you spoke about, when I was 10, I met a man named Damien. I mean, you don't say what happened, but you just said, I met this man, and you don't show quite a lot of things, and you do show certain details like a mohair carpet. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about your sort of creative process of how you decide where to put the frame and maybe some of the decisions you made when creating your work, Becoming Unbecoming.
Okay, yeah, it took a long time to work it through because at first I had what I thought was quite a clear idea of how I was going to write the story. And as obviously, the kind of writing and drawing process are pretty seamless. I'm doing them both at the same time. So as I was making drawings, I was encountering the kind of problems which seem theoretical until you actually apply them. So clearly, I didn't want to make accidental child pornography. So there was that. So very early, I thought, okay, I need a way to depict what's happening in a way that kind of pierces into honesty and truthfulness and reality, but without kind of causing another crime to be committed, but also kind of in a way that didn't disturb my own peace of mind too much. And also that I thought, I don't want to kind of repel people. I want people to be drawn in. I want them to think and be able to approach the work under their own control, if you like. So I suppose what I'm saying is there's a reason it took 7 years, and there's a lot of work that isn't in the book that's just in a folder here in my studio that I'll probably never show, actually. I'm not even sure why I'm keeping it, and I do occasionally look at it, actually. And I'm glad I didn't put it in the book. I'm glad the book emerged in the way it did, but it was a constant process of adjustment, trying to be as restrained as possible while still telling the truth. And so there are moments of puncture, like the jeans, which are difficult to take off. So there are sort of very small moments which tell you what's happening without having to be properly explicit.
Yeah. No, thanks. Yeah. Yeah, and Shivanee, I found that as well in your work, in that there's certain details which you highlight, like because your work is so sensory, certain sensory details or textures that are highlighted, or smells or sounds, and it's almost like those details are standing in for the whole, or the whole of the experience. So yeah, did you have to do quite a lot of thinking about that? Or I know in previous interviews you said some poems just sort of emerged on their own, and others you worked at for a very long time.
Yes, and with the work that emerged almost instantaneously, it took me a long time to accept that I had worked on those poems, and that just because they appeared on the page at a certain point didn't mean I hadn't been working at them, turning them over and over in my mind, fixating on an image or a location or an object. And so much of my writing of these poems was deeply subconscious in that way. I think because I resisted writing them for so long, there was this immense wall of distance that I had put between myself and the work. And then to access it, it often came through the image, through the police station, through the hummingbird vase, or the deer, or the barbed wire, or the red thread. Like, the red thread was so valuable to me as something literally that I felt I was holding on to tell the work as truthfully as I could. And it really sustained the energy of these poems, which were written across a definite time period of 5 years, and probably in some cases longer than that. And so I held on to that thread, and I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah, and obviously it shows in your work. And I think having a concrete, I suppose abstract, but a specific symbol like the red thread, I think is so important in sustaining anybody through a creation of work or a creation of art around this particular issue. I mean, Susan, did you have something like that? Was there a particular detail or a particular kind of symbol for you which helped sustain you through the writing of Aftermath, which is obviously not just a memoir. It's a memoir, and then there's quite a lot of scholarly, philosophical exploration in here as well. I was just wondering if there was a particular through line or a particular image or symbol for you that really helped sustain you through it. And also,
it's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, and I was also wondering if really quickly, the problems of Microsoft Teams. Also, in your answer, if you also want to talk a little bit about how your own work as a scholar or as a philosopher was challenged, because you've mentioned in your book how obviously philosophy traditionally is a white male field where people are thinking abstractly about universal truths. And as a feminist, is there a universal truth for every human being out there, right? And can you actually separate personal experience from kind of scholarly thinking like that? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that as well in your
Thanks.
answer.
Yeah, and Una's and Shivanee's comments really brought home to me that, I mean, it's really difficult talking about male gender-based sexual violence against women without making some kind of accidental pornography, or without, it's very difficult. And I before I was assaulted, I was working on pornography and hate speech. That's what I do, work on free speech theory as a philosopher of law. You all just brilliantly have these ways of using some motif or using something fictional to just, I mean, it hits me in the gut but you don't come right out and say, and then you did this, and then you did that, because it's not necessary. In my case, in the first paragraph I read, I did do that, and I did it because I'm in a discipline, 30 years ago, philosophers didn't talk about rape. I mean, when I started, I gave my first talk about it almost 30 years ago, and was told by my senior colleagues, that's not philosophy. Don't talk about rape if you want to get tenure. Don't do this, don't do that, don't speak out. And the things that were written at the time, like about personal identity and the self, involved only far-fetched thought experiments. Like, imagine that the brain of the cobbler is put into the body of the prince and they're reversed, and who is the resulting entity? And imagine your atoms are zapped and you're teletransported to some distant galaxy, and then everything is put back together again. Are you the same person? And I'm like, we have all of this material. What I read Holocaust testimonies, but there was also testimony from domestic violence survivors, rape survivors, Vietnam War vets, people who'd experienced trauma of various kinds, and all of them were saying, I'm not the same person I was before. I died in that ravine. And I thought, that's it. Why don't we as philosophers look at what real people say about actual events that happened to them? And that's becoming more acceptable now, but at the time, it was like that's not how we do things. We look at things from a God's eye point of view, and it shouldn't matter what gender you are, what race you are, what happens to you in your life. You just think as a pure thinker, use your rationality. And so, yeah, I mean, I'd already been reading critical race theory and feminist philosophy, and so I was not buying into that view of what philosophers should do, but it was just brought home to me very viscerally that, although I talked about my disoriented self, no, the problem is not that I'm damaged and I just don't understand, how philosophy really should be done. It's like, no, I learned something from that experience. And I want other philosophers to learn that too. At least I want to be able to tell them about this, and then they can take it or leave it. But yeah. I also, just one more thing in case there isn't time. What happened to me, what happened to Winnie is so unusual in that, I mean, it's all too usual because it happens to women all the time, all over the world. I can't tell you how many women contacted me and said, oh, that happened to me too. I was raped and almost murdered and I was left for dead. It happens. But the vast majority of rapes are not like that. They're not strangers jumping out of the bushes. And that's what's really hard to talk about. And I just want to say it took me much, much longer to write something. I wrote a Time magazine piece in December 2014 about having been raped when I was 20, and I was an exchange student at a college in England. And I opened the door, and someone knocked on the door. I was asleep. I had my nightgown on, and someone knocked on the door. I let him in, and he raped me. But I didn't call that rape. I felt so, but I knew, I thought I had done something to blame. I mean, Una's piece just resonated with me so much. And it took me, until 2014 to even say something publicly about that. It's so difficult when you're just taught to blame yourself. The only reason it was easy for me to talk about what happened to me in France was I couldn't find anything. I wanted to find something that I had done so-called wrong. I mean, no rape victim has done anything wrong, but wanted to know, what did I do so I could avoid doing that in the future so that this won't happen again? And guess what? It turns out there's nothing that women can do. You can be alone in your bedroom. You can be in your apartment in the middle of the night. You can be walking in broad daylight. That's what I wanted to add.
Yeah, no, but thank you for that. And it is so important to obviously point out that, Susan, you and I, our experiences of stranger rape, the stranger jumping out of the bushes, even though it fits the media profile that we see in movies and TV shows all the time, is actually the minority of experiences of sexual violence, because most people know their attackers, or sort of there's that issue of vulnerability as well. If you're like somebody like Una, who was a child, you don't have the ability or the tools or even the audience that's listening to you and wanting to hear those stories. So then that makes recovery so much more of a submerged process, I suppose. I was going to say something and it's just gone straight out of my head. So I suppose, Emma, if you wanted to start curating some of the questions that might be coming from the audience. I don't know if there's anything coming through right now. Obviously, there's lots that we can talk about. One thing I'd love to talk about is the criminal justice process, or the criminal justice system, because we've all kind of addressed it in our work. I mean, Shivanee, one of your poems is about being in a police station, and obviously, Una, so much of your work is just about how there's this incredible failure on the part of the police to actually catch the man who was the Yorkshire Ripper. And Susan, you had interesting experience, quite positive, but also a very weird experience with the criminal justice system in France. And my experience in Belfast was a bit bizarre as well, even though there was a positive outcome. So that's something we could talk about as well. Emma, are there any questions coming through that
thank you, Winnie, and obviously thank you to the panel for such a ridiculously powerful discussion. There are actually a few questions kind of pertaining to justice. If I can kind of wrap those into one for you guys to discuss. I think firstly what you said, Winnie, about the kind of what you all felt or how you all feel about the criminal justice system and its role or its failures. But also other people have been asking about kind of your own perceptions of having justice or not having justice in the telling of the stories or at various points, how that's affected how you approach your experience and how you handle the trauma in your writing and your process.
If I'm chairing, I don't want to be the first person to speak.
Okay, yeah. I think I kind of chose to focus on the criminal aspect and the justice aspect in this particular talk. It's not something that I always... Becoming Unbecoming is just so broad. Every time I talk about it, I try to just kind of pick one aspect and talk about that. But I suppose the fact that I didn't get any help from the criminal justice system, and I didn't get what people might call justice, in the sense that there have been no trials, there haven't even been any charges made, despite the fact that I can identify two of the people who raped me when I was a child. But my whole book is about a failure of the criminal justice system and 13 women who were murdered completely unnecessarily because Peter Sutcliffe could have been caught before he even killed anyone, actually. But the police were the same police that didn't catch Jimmy Savile, the same police who were going around to Jimmy Savile's house, the same police who were actually central to another miscarriage of justice with a man with learning disabilities called Stefan Kisko. People talk about the Met, and there's been obviously horrific stuff around Sarah Everard and the many police officers that shouldn't be police officers. But West Yorkshire Police Force have a lot of form. It's really disheartening because I do know a lot of lawyers working in women's services, and I know a lot of people who, are independent sexual violence advocates and, that kind of thing. People are working so hard with juries, people are working so hard to try to make a change, and yet somehow it never changes. There was just a huge wave of reporting after the Jimmy Savile scandal broke, and there was a tiny little peak where there was a few more successful prosecutions, and then it just immediately evaporated again, and we're back to where we were originally. How to make things change? I personally think it's a whole culture change. And that's why I'm hoping, I think Clear Lines is a really, really good kind of idea, to try to just get people talking. This is why I want to make something where people making things, because I think the more stuff gets made, the more when people say that things don't make any difference, culture doesn't make a difference, I think, well, why bother then? But also I think, well, why would look at propaganda, look at the kind of, not that I'm saying we should make propaganda, but it has, there are cultural forces that we can use that may eventually change what it's like on the ground, but it's certainly not for lack of effort.
Can I jump in, Winnie?
Go ahead. Yeah, too soon. Yeah.
I agree with everything that Una said, and actually, it was in reading Unbecoming, and the things that the police said about the Yorkshire Ripper and about the victims. I mean, the misogyny, the racism in the U.S. in what Mariam Kaba calls the criminal injustice system, which is what it is here in the U.S., has convinced me that's not the solution to gender-based violence. It really isn't. I mean, over the years, I've become a prison abolitionist and a police department abolitionist. I mean, this is a bit extreme. But what I want to say is that in the case of my assailant, I apprehended physical evidence. I was convinced that he had done what he did to me before and that he would do it again. And because of his age, I thought it's a good thing that he was off the streets for 10 years. But I don't think incarceration is a solution. And although I was the most incredibly lucky victim, everybody, even the defense lawyer, believed my story about the physical facts of what happened, and expressed their dismay and how brave I was and all of it. I mean, when does that happen to a rape victim? That happened. But nobody got what I wanted to bear witness to, which is this didn't just happen to me. This is a larger political issue in a society that's misogynistic, and this happens to lots of women all the time. The criminal justice system isn't set up to address that. They just want to know, okay, did he do that to her on this occasion? That's the end of the story. My own lawyer, I mentioned before, said, don't think of your assailant as a man. Think of him as a wild animal, a beast. It's like, well, actually, he was a Frenchman, like you, but that couldn't be said. And the Attorney General, as I was preparing for the trial, said, after the trial is over, you must forget that this ever happened. So I thought, well, that's going to be a challenge. He was like, but madame, you must make an effort. As if this had happened only to me, as if gender had nothing to do with it. And so that's why I keep speaking about this, but I don't think the solution is longer prison sentences for perpetrators. And in the US, it's really affecting Black women who fight back. Look up Google survived and punished. There are lots of Black women who fought back against their perpetrators, and they're in prison. Right. So, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think you've both said a lot, so I don't really want to have to. I mean, what else can I add? I mean, in my case, I did have justice in the traditional sense, right? And I reported to the police, and I went through this forensic exam, and gave my evidence, and he was arrested a few days later. And then Susan, you had to wait 2.5 years before the trial, which is crazy in my mind, because you're in some ways. Possibly your life was put on hold for 2.5 years. In my case, I had to wait 11 months before the trial against my rapist, and I flew all the way to Belfast to testify. And at the very last minute, like the morning of the trial, he pleaded guilty. So I suddenly didn't have to testify, and I had the result I wanted, I suppose. So that was a bit of an emotional roller coaster in some ways, and I kind of felt like, oh, but I didn't get my chance to tell my side of the story, which in retrospect, I don't think I would have, I didn't want to sit in a trial and speak in front of the public about those things. So that kind of prompted me to write the novel the way I did, because I wanted to tell my side of the story, but fictionalized to create that distance and that level of privacy for me, but then also to try to explore his side of the story, and then also to create a fictional trial, right? And to imagine what the trial could have been like, because I ended up doing a lot of research into how rape trials actually go in the UK, and they're pretty horrific experiences. for most victim complainants, complainant being the term that you're supposed to use legally. So I felt like that needed to be captured, and the kind of the emotional torture of the trial and lead up to the trial is something that, audiences need to know about, really, and how oftentimes or often isn't, you go through that entire process and then you don't get the conviction against your rapist. So what is the point of criminal justice system then? So that was kind of my take on the criminal justice system. And I did also, but Susan, you're right in that in my case, fine, there was individual justice, I suppose. He was out on the streets, away from the streets for 4 years, and he's out now. But like, what difference does it make? Because, I mean, that's a drop in the ocean of all the different perpetrators that are out there. And that's a drop in the ocean compared to all the other assaults that have happened that never got, apprehended or never resulted in a conviction. Shivanee, did you want to speak at all to this point, or should we move on? Or
figures of authority show up often in my poems about sexual violence and otherwise, I suppose. So there's a poem in the Red Thread cycle that is called "The Policeman in Your Throat." I think a lot about what compels people to great heights of power that they then go on to abuse, because I believe fully it is a human failing, a common human pot from which we all draw, but then the ways in which we act on it and then are held accountable for it are so different and so involved in misogyny and racism and xenophobia. And I'm often asked, when will I stop writing rape poems? Like, it is, one, something I just decided to do for fun, or two, a valve that you can just turn on and off when it suits you. And the gender-based violence has increased significantly in Trinidad and Tobago and across the Caribbean since various lockdowns to deal with COVID-19. And that's unmistakable correlation about what we've been speaking about, is that the sexual violence does not only take place on the deserted road or the abandoned car park, that you can be profoundly unsafe with your choice of partner. And the police effort in result to this has been so disheartening and so deeply misogynistic that I think, actually, I will never stop writing rape poems, and people should not expect that from me. If they do, it is their ultimate disappointment, because there will never be a point in time when I can be silent. Even if I could choose, I don't think I could. Which is not to say I think I have some holy mission from God, or that I have a divinely appointed right to speak about the sexual violence that we all experience. But when the people who are mandated or who choose to wear vestments of protection do the exact opposite, there will be no ending to the poems. And I'm not sorry about it.
Thank you so much for sharing that bit of insight, especially about the impact of COVID-19 on everyday lived experiences for women. Just a quick note, if you're not one of the speakers, if you're not Susan, Shivanee, Louisa, or Emma, if you could please turn off your camera, because we're really only supposed to be capturing certain people on screen. The video is going to get saved and put out later on, so it might be a little bit awkward from a release form perspective if other people are on it on screen. So
can I just jump in and add to that, because I'm so grateful to Shivanee and to Una and to Winnie for continuing to tell your stories. I mean, nobody should tell you when you're going to stop writing rape poems. But also, it's very clear that we all told those stories for some of the same reasons, or mainly the same reason, which is that what happened to us didn't just happen to us. It's a much larger phenomenon. And we need to bear witness to this. We need to give our testimony. In my case, not just to that one incident, that one thing that happened to me, but something that is going on and happens to many other women. And so, I haven't read that description of my assault for a long time, and I read it and it's like, yeah, I'm just reading the news or something. It doesn't get me in the gut like it gets other people. I'm bored with that. I'm fine. I'm totally okay. but I'm going to keep bearing witness to gender-based violence against women, because if we don't have any hope of eradicating it. I mean, much of the first part of my book was that people just dismissed what happened to me. They didn't talk about it. And so, I mean, we will continue to talk about it. So thank you.
Emma, were there any other questions to raise? I mean, we're running really close on time, so if we want to be like short in our answers, I suppose.
Yes, I was conscious of that. So I was going to ask, just lots of people are sort of asking about kind of how to tell stories of sexual violence. And so I just thought maybe you could all go around briefly and say sort of what the impact was on you telling your story in the forms that you have, whether you felt an imperative to tell it, and what do you feel you gained by doing so?
I would say be cautious about doing this for other people. Do it because you want to do it for yourself. I would also say be cautious about using it for therapy.
How can I go through something like this and not, in the end, write about it, right? Because that is my lifeblood, and I wouldn't be able to actually move into the world again and make sense of my life if I hadn't really sort of taken this like material, I suppose, and turned it into work of I suppose literature or work of writing. So for me, I wanted to actually do it as a fiction because it was kind of essential for me to try to explore the character of that perpetrator, and I suppose the writing of it allowed me to kind of transform that raw material of the experience of trauma into something that could hopefully connect with other people. And I think it is just really vitally important to have printed works of literature out there on shelves that people can encounter and read. Because there's something about the writing and the reading process that gives you the complete agency to be able to pick up a book and read it and put it down and come back to it months later or weeks later or a time when you're actually ready. And the same way about the writing process, you can start writing something and put it away. So it's not, it's very different from doing a live performance. It's very different, from doing academic work, right? There isn't the timeline that you're required to write on. So it's completely, your own agency in terms of how you want to write something and how you want to read it. And so I think that's what I found very powerful, was encountering works of other literature written by Shivanee and Una and Susan and so many other writers out there who've kind of written from their heart and from their own experiences.
I just want to add to that my agreement with Una that I really don't want to be taken as saying every survivor has an obligation to speak out, a moral or political obligation. I mean, that is just not the case. And I actually spend lots of time counseling women, college, university students before Take Back the Night marches or speak outs, saying, this may not be empowering for you and this may not be the place. And once that story is out there, you're not in control of it. It may not be therapeutic, so you have to really think about your context. Also, I don't take myself to be speaking for any other rape survivors. I struggle with that because, I can't generalize from my experience, but if it was something that only happened to me, I wouldn't bother writing about it. Who cares? But I think it's just, for me, it was important to tell my story because it was easy. I had all this unearned privilege. It was a relatively easy story to tell. And in hopes that it would make it more possible for other people with less unearned privilege to tell their stories.
I am so moved and feeling very emotional by everything we've all shared. And I'd like to add to the excellent and generous things that Una and Winnie and Susan have offered, is that it's dangerous to try to, even if you are asked to, tell someone else's story of sexual violence. And that if you agree to that kind of undertaking, to be careful with yourself and the possibly unintended repercussions of what that might involve. Because while it may feel like a good and equitable idea at the time, there is sometimes no way to know where that process will take either of you in that transaction. I have also spent a lot of time thinking about how GBV affects people outside of the binary gender system, and how people who are not cisgender contend with serious assaults in their homes and their domestic partnerships or otherwise, when they may look to the world to be a man, but they are not, but that label is thrust upon them. And then, though I am not a transgender person, how your pain and trauma is further complicated because your gender truth is not acknowledged. And finally, I would say, and this is maybe the most personal, is that as much as you give in the process of your writing, in what you put on the page or on display, you will almost inevitably be asked to give more. You will be asked to share things that are outside your realm of comfort. And so you can think, and I thought that I have told the absolute truth that I can, and surely nobody needs to know more than this. But people sometimes need to know more than this. And then to that, I would say to please be gentle with yourself and to understand that it is perfectly fine to create safety and community where you do not have to be beholden to answer every single question, and that you, as a wielder and a witness, are fully allowed to give yourself grace, and that healing is ongoing.
In some ways, the work is endless. I mean, Shivanee, you said, you're never going to stop writing poems, right? Because the crimes, unfortunately, the crimes keep on happening, and these experiences keep happening. And then you've recovered to some extent, and you were able to, live a more normal life. But you're always going to continue hearing these stories, right? And every single story or every single news report would have that impact, and in some ways, either bring the trauma back or bring back a whole cycle of thoughts. And then I think we can never really run out of writing stories about these experiences, because until the problem is fixed in our society, which some may say it's impossibly completely fixed, right? Are we ever going to achieve that moment of progress where we can say everything is fine on the issue of gender-based violence? There's always going to be work to be done. So in some ways, we're always going to be asked to do work, and as activists, you're always going to want to continue to do more work, even though you may want to draw a line around things. And so that emotional labor is something that is huge. And there is the emotional labor of writing these books and of continuing to go through life and through the world as someone with lived experience. And there's the emotional labor of deciding to work professionally on this issue. And the fact that it is hard to just there's not a bulb you can turn on and off, as you said. There's not a switch where you can say, all right, yeah, I'm going to stop thinking about gender-based violence, right? So I guess the question is, how do we protect ourselves? What are the ethics of self-care? If we want to be engaged in these issues, either someone with experience or somebody who's passionate about it. And I suppose we're going to go on for just another few minutes, but do either of you have anything to say, or any of you have something to say about self-care or strategies you've had, or maybe developments in how you've decided to approach working on these issues?
I'd like to follow up on what Shivanee was saying about non-binary people and trans people. And it also is connected with telling our stories. We have to be very careful about the use that other people are going to make of what we say. And that more and more often, I find myself saying, not in my name. When Trump could say, oh, rapists coming in from Mexico to rape our women, don't use survivor stories to further your political agenda, especially when the survivors don't have that same agenda. And because this is in the UK, I feel the obligation to say something about some philosophers, who are saying people who survive sexual violence walk around terrified that they're going to see some man's penis in a locker room or in a bathroom, or it's no, not in my name. This is not my experience. I don't want my story to be used in that way. So yeah, I just wanted to make that last point. Thanks.
Can I just say that I think the most important thing really is to remember that you can live and you can survive after this. Lots of people do. There are millions of us walking around, and until very recently, keeping it to ourselves. I think the the last 10 years has shown massive progress simply in the fact that we are all sitting here talking about it right now. And when I was researching the book, I went to a huge conference called Stop Rape in War, which took place in London in, I think, 2015, where tens of thousands of people from all over the world gathered together under one roof to talk about rape. And there's a huge appetite to talk about these issues. People don't seem to know how to talk about these issues. And I think that the arts, which, you know, I mean, really powerful work that we've heard today, I think the arts can really help us to move forward and have discussions. I think the other thing is that the truth will set you free. You know, no matter how hard it is, that's the way forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you're right. I mean, the truth will set you free, as you said, and somehow through art you're able to create a way for your truth to be heard and seen, or listened to in some ways. And you know, you can create art and have nobody read about it, right? I mean, as a writer, we're constantly terrified of like the quality of things that we're writing. So it's perfectly okay to just write something and just put it in a book and shove it into a corner and have it not written. But in some ways the act of self-expression is one thing. And then as an artist, obviously, if you hone and refine the work that you're creating and then get it to a point where you feel like it's something that the public or a small group of people can read, then that is in some ways the beginning of a journey to getting the truth out. I think we've now run over time, so we're going to unfortunately have to wrap up, and I'm going to hand it over to Professor Jo Bourke to close us out. But I mean, honestly, thank you. It has been such a meaningful conversation and so powerful, and it's been great to connect with Susan, Shivanee, Una, and everybody else that's contributed to the chat. Please check out everyone's work. I think all the links for purchasing Becoming Unbecoming. I've got all the books here, right? So like everyone knows I'm a haunting. There's a bit of glare. Becoming Unbecoming, and Susan's book Aftermath, and then this is mine, Dark Chapter. And these are the works we created, and there's so many more books out there, so many other works of art as well. At Clear Lines, obviously, we try to create conversations that are survivor-centered, focusing on the arts and discussion to address lived experiences. So if you want to sign up to know more about stuff what we're doing, I think I'll put the link in for a newsletter. And then I'm going to hand this over to Professor Jo Bourke, who can tell us a little bit more about things that are happening with the SHaME project. But thank you so much to the three.
Thank you so much, Winnie, for organising.
Thank you.
Just to say for everyone, particularly to you, Winnie, and of course the panelists, and Clear Lines for what has been an incredible, really incredible event. I also want to thank Ria Sukliosin, who, without her work or with us at SHaME, there would be no events like this. So really, really grateful, as well as behind the scenes people such as Adeline, Emma, and Ruth, who have also played really vital roles behind the scenes. Winnie has one final public event, which is coming up on Wednesday, the 26th of May, 5 o'clock to 6:30 BST. The details will be forthcoming, but please come to that. Tell your friends, tell your colleagues to join us for that. Really, it's going to be a wonderful final event for her as writer in residence. But we also have other events. We've got a symposium coming up on the 11th and 12th of May. You can find all these details on our website. And we also have a major festival of activism against sexual violence, which will be in November. But everything is on our website, shame.bbk.ac.uk. So please just check us out there. And finally, thanks to everyone who came and for the fantastic comments that have been in the chats. I hope that, well, I've certainly learned a lot from this whole session, and I look forward to engaging with everyone further. Take care. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.